Riley kept waiting for an answer, but instead there followed an endless silence. Riley sensed that some special fear was working its way inside Marie. In the silence, Riley looked around the apartment and her eyes fell upon Marie's landline phone. She was surprised to see it was disconnected from the wall. "What's the matter with your phone?" Riley asked. Marie looked positively stricken, and Riley realized she had hit a real nerve. "He keeps calling me," Marie said, in an almost inaudible whisper. "Who?" "Peterson." Riley's heart jumped up into her throat. "Peterson is dead," Riley replied, her voice shaky. "I torched the place. They found his body." Marie shook her head. "It could have been anyone they found. It wasn't him." Riley felt a flush of panic. Her own worst fears were being brought back. "Everybody says it was," Riley said. "And you really believe that?" Riley didn't know what to say. Now was no time to confide her own fears. After all, Marie was probably being delusional. But how could Riley convince her of something that she didn't altogether believe herself? "He keeps calling," Marie said again. "He calls and breathes and hangs up. I know it's him. He's alive. He's still stalking me." Riley felt a cold, creeping dread. "It's probably just an obscene phone caller," she said, pretending to be calm. "But I can get the bureau to check it out anyway. I can get them to send out a surveillance car if you're scared. They'll trace the calls." "No," Marie said sharply. "No!" Riley stared back, puzzled. "Why not?" she asked. "I don't want to make him angry," Marie said in a pathetic whimper. Riley, overwhelmed, feeling a panic attack coming on, suddenly realized it had been a terrible idea to come here. If anything, she felt worse. She knew she could not sit in this oppressive dining room a moment longer. "I've got to go," Riley said, talking. "I'm so sorry, my daughter's waiting." Marie suddenly grabbed Riley's wrist with surprising strength, digging her nails into her skin. She stared back, her icy blue eyes holding such intensity that it terrified Riley. That haunting look seared into her soul. "Take the case," Marie urged. Riley could see in her eyes that Marie was confusing the new case and Peterson, blurring them together into one. "Find that son of a bitch," she added, "and kill him for me." The man kept a short but discreet distance from the woman, glancing her way only fleetingly. He placed a few token items into his handbasket so that he'd look just like another shopper. He congratulated himself on how inconspicuous he was able to make himself. No one would guess his true power. But then again, he'd never been the kind of man who attracted much attention. As a child, he'd felt practically invisible. Now, at long last, he was able to turn his own innocuousness to his advantage. Just a few moments ago, he had stood right next to her, scarcely more than 2 feet away. Wrapped in choosing her shampoo, she hadn't noticed him at all. He knew plenty about her, though. He knew her name was Cindy, that her husband owned an art gallery, that she worked in a free medical clinic. Today was one of her days off. Right now she was on her cell phone talking with somebody, her sister it sounded like. She was laughing at something the person was saying to her. He burned red with anger, wondering if she were laughing at him, just as all the girls used to. His fury increased. Cindy wore shorts, a tank top, and expensive-looking running shoes. He'd watched her from his car, jogging, and waited until she'd finished her run and came into the grocery store. He knew her routine for a non-working day like this. She'd take the items home and put them away, take a shower, then drive to meet her husband for lunch. Her good figure owed a lot to physical exercise. She was no more than 30 years old, but the skin around her thighs wasn't tight anymore. She'd probably lost a lot of weight at one time or another, perhaps pretty recently. She was undoubtedly proud of that. Suddenly, the woman headed toward the nearest cash register. The man was taken by surprise. She had finished shopping earlier than usual. He rushed to get in line behind her, almost pushing another customer aside to do so. He silently berated himself for that. As the cashier rang up the woman's items, he inched up and stood extremely close to her. Close enough to smell her body, now sweaty and pungent after her vigorous jog. It was a smell that he expected to become much better acquainted with very soon. But the smell would then be mixed with yet another odour, one that fascinated him because of its strangeness and mystery. The smell of pain and terror. For a moment, the lurker felt exhilarated, even pleasantly lightheaded, with eager anticipation. After paying for her groceries, she pushed her cart out through the automatic glass doors and out into the parking lot. He felt no hurry now about paying for his own handful of items. He didn't need to follow her home. He'd been there already, had even been inside her house. He had even handled her clothing. He'd taken up his vigil again when she got off work. It won't be long now, he thought. Not long at all. After Cindy McKinnon got into her car, she sat there for a moment, feeling shaken and not knowing why. She remembered the weird feeling she'd just had back in the supermarket. It was an uncanny, irrational feeling of being watched. But it was more than that. It took her a few moments to put her finger on it. Finally, she realized it was a feeling that someone had meant her harm. She shivered deeply. During the last few days, that feeling had been coming and going. She chided herself, sure that it was completely groundless. She shook her head, ridding herself of any vestiges of that feeling. As she started her car, she forced herself to think of something else, and she smiled at her cell phone conversation with her sister, Becky. Later this afternoon, Cindy would help her throw a big birthday party for her 3-year-old daughter, complete with cake and balloons. It would be a beautiful day, she thought. Riley sat in the SUV beside Bill as he shifted gears, pushing the Bureau's 4-wheel drive vehicle higher into the hills, and she wiped her palms on her pants legs. She didn't know what to make of the sweatiness, and she didn't know what to make of being here. After 6 weeks off the job, she felt out of touch with what her body was telling her. Being back felt surreal. Riley was disturbed by the awkward tension. She and Bill had barely spoken during their hour-plus drive. Their old camaraderie, their playfulness, their uncanny rapport, none of that was there now. Riley felt pretty sure she knew why Bill was being so aloof. It wasn't out of rudeness. It was out of worry. He, too, seemed to have doubts about whether she should be back on the job. They drove toward Mosby State Park, where Bill had told her he had seen the most recent murder victim. As they went, Riley took in the geography all around her, and slowly, her old sense of professionalism kicked in. She knew she had to snap out of it. "Find that son of a bitch and kill him for me." Marie's words haunted her, drove her on, made her choice simple. But nothing seemed that simple now. For one thing, she couldn't help worrying about April. Sending her to stay at her father's house wasn't ideal for anybody involved. But today was Saturday, and Riley didn't want to wait until Monday to see the crime scene. The deep silence began to add to her anxiety, and she desperately felt the need to talk. Racking her brain for something to say, finally, she said, "So are you going to tell me what's going on between you and Maggie?" Bill turned to her, a surprised look on his face, and she couldn't tell if it was due to her breaking the silence or her blunt question. Whichever it was, she immediately regretted it. Her bluntness, many people told her, could be off-putting. She never meant to be blunt, just had no time to waste. Bill exhaled. She thinks I'm having an affair. Riley felt a jolt of surprise. What? With my job? Bill said, laughing a bit sourly. She thinks I'm having an affair with my job. She thinks I love all this more than I love her. I keep telling her she's being silly. Anyway, I can't exactly end it. Not my job, anyway. Riley shook her head. Sounds just like Ryan. He used to get jealous as hell when we were still together. She stopped short of telling Bill the whole truth. Her ex-husband hadn't been jealous of Riley's job. He'd been jealous of Bill. She'd often wondered if Ryan might have had some reason. Despite today's awkwardness, she felt awfully good just being close to Bill. Was that feeling solely professional? I hope this isn't a wasted trip, Bill said. The crime scene's been all cleaned up, you know. I know. I just want to see the place for myself. Pictures and reports don't cut it for me. Riley was starting to feel a bit woozy now. She was pretty sure it was from the altitude as they climbed still higher. Anticipation had something to do with it too. Her palms were still sweating. How much further, she asked as she watched the woods get thicker, the terrain more remote. Not far. A couple of minutes later, Bill turned off the paved road onto a pair of rough tyre tracks. The vehicle bounced along jarringly, then came to a stop about a quarter of a mile into the dense woods. He switched off the ignition, then turned toward Riley and looked at her with concern. You sure you want to do this? He asked. She knew exactly what was worrying him. He was afraid she'd flash back to her traumatic captivity. Never mind that this was a different case altogether, and a different killer. She nodded. I'm sure, she said, not at all convinced that she was telling the truth. She got out of the car and followed Bill off the road onto a brushy, narrow path through the woods. She heard the gurgling of a nearby stream. As the vegetation grew thicker, she had to push her way past low-hanging branches, and sticky little burrs started bunching up on her pants legs. She was annoyed at the thought of having to pick them off. At last, she and Bill emerged onto the creek bank. Riley was immediately struck by what a lovely spot it was. The afternoon sunlight poured in through the leaves, mottling the rippling water with kaleidoscopic light. The steady gurgling of the stream was soothing. It was strange to think of this as a gruesome crime scene. She was found right here, Bill said, leading her to a broad, level boulder. When they got there, Riley stood and looked all around and breathed deeply. Yes, she had been right to come here. She was starting to feel that. The pictures? Riley asked. She crouched beside Bill on the boulder, and they started leafing through a folder full of photographs taken shortly after Reba Fry's body had been found. Another folder was stuffed with reports and photos of the murder she and Bill had investigated 6 months ago, the one that they had failed to solve. Those pictures brought back vivid memories of the first killing. It transported her right back to that farm country near Daggett. She remembered how Rogers had been staged in a similar manner, against a tree. A lot like our older case, Riley observed. Both women in their 30s, both with little kids. That seems to be part of his MO. He's got it in for mothers. We need to check with parenting groups. Find out if there are any connections between the two women, or between their kids. I'll get somebody onto it, Bill said. He was taking notes now. Riley continued poring through the reports and photos, comparing them to the actual scene. Same method of strangulation with a pink ribbon, she observed. Another wig, and the same type of artificial rose in front of the body. Riley held up 2 photographs side by side. Eyes stitched open too, she said. If I remember right, the technicians found that Roger's eyes had been stitched post-mortem. Was it the same with Fry? Yeah. I guess he wanted them to watch him. even after they were dead. Riley felt a sudden tingle up her spine. She'd almost forgotten that feeling. She got it whenever something about a case was just about to click and make sense. She didn't know whether to feel encouraged or terrified. "No," she said, "that's not it. He didn't care whether the women saw him." "Then why did he do it?" Riley didn't reply. Ideas were starting to rush into her brain. She was exhilarated, but she wasn't yet ready to put any of it into words, not even to herself. She laid out pairs of photographs on the boulder, pointing out details to Bill. "They're not exactly the same," she said. "The body wasn't as carefully staged back in Daggett. He tried to move that corpse when it was already stiff. My guess is, this time, he brought her here before rigor mortis set in. Otherwise he couldn't have posed her so..." She suppressed the urge to finish the sentence with "nicely." Then she realised that was exactly the kind of word she'd have used when she was on the job before her capture and torture. Yes, she was getting back into the spirit of things, and she felt the same old dark obsession growing inside her. Pretty soon, there'd be no turning back. But was that a good thing or a bad thing? "What's with Fry's eyes?" she asked, pointing to a photo. "That blue doesn't look real." "Contacts," Bill answered. The tingle in Riley's spine grew stronger. Eileen Rogers's corpse hadn't had contact lenses. It was an important difference. "And the shine on her skin?" she asked. "Vaseline," Bill said. "Another important difference." She felt her ideas snapping into place with breathtaking speed. "What has forensics found out about the wig?" she asked Bill. "Nothing yet, except that it was pieced together out of pieces of cheap wigs." Riley's excitement grew. For the last murder, the killer had used a simple, whole wig, not something patched together. Like the rose, it had been so cheap that forensics couldn't trace it. Riley felt parts of the puzzle coming together. Not the whole puzzle, but a big chunk of it. "What does forensics plan to do about this wig?" she asked. "The same as last time. Run a search of its fibres, try to track it down through hairpiece outlets." Startled by the fierce certainty in her own voice, Riley said, "They're wasting their time." Bill looked at her, clearly caught off guard. "Why?" She felt a familiar impatience with Bill, one she felt when she always found herself thinking a step or two ahead of him. "Look at the picture. He's trying to show us. Blue contacts to make the eyes look like they're not real. Eyelids stitched so the eyes stay wide open. The body propped up, legs splayed out, freakishly. Vaseline to make the skin look like plastic. A wig pieced together out of pieces of little wigs. Not human wigs, dolls' wigs. He wanted both victims to look like dolls, like naked dolls on display." "Jesus," Bill said, feverishly taking notes. "Why didn't we see this last time, back in Daggett?" The answer seemed so obvious to Riley that she stifled an impatient groan. "He wasn't good enough at it yet," she said. "He was still figuring out how to send the message. He's learning as he goes." Bill looked up from his notepad and shook his head admiringly. "Damn, I've missed you." As much as she appreciated the compliment, Riley knew that an even bigger realization was on its way, and she knew from years of experience that there was no forcing it. She simply had to relax and let it come to her, unbidden. She crouched on the boulder silently, waiting for it to happen. As she waited, she picked idly at the burrs on her pants legs. "What a damn nuisance," she thought. Suddenly, her eyes fell on the stone surface under her feet. Other little burrs, some of them whole, others broken into fragments, were lying amid the burrs she was plucking off now. "Bill," she said, her voice quavering with excitement, "were these little burrs here when you found the body?" Bill shrugged. "I don't know." Her hands shaking and sweating more than ever. She grabbed a bunch of pictures and rifled through them until she found a front view of the corpse. There, between her splayed legs, right around the rose, was a group of little smudges. Those were the burrs, the very burrs she had just found. But nobody had thought they were important. Nobody had bothered to take a sharper, closer picture of them. And nobody had even bothered to sweep them away when the crime scene was cleaned up. Riley closed her eyes, bringing her imagination fully into play. She felt lightheaded, even dizzy. It was a sensation that she knew all too well, a feeling of falling into an abyss, into a terrible black void, into the killer's evil mind. She was stepping into his shoes, into his experience. It was a dangerous and terrifying place to be, but it was where she belonged, at least right now. She embraced it. She felt the killer's confidence as he lugged the body down the path to the stream, perfectly sure that he wasn't going to get caught, in no hurry at all. He might well have been humming or whistling. She felt his patience, his craft and skill as he posed the corpse on the boulder. And she could see the grisly tableau through his eyes. She felt his deep satisfaction at a job well done, the same warm feeling of fulfillment that she always felt when she'd solved a case. He had crouched on this rock, pausing for a moment, or for as long as he liked, to admire his own handiwork. And as he did, he had plucked the burrs off his pants legs. He took his time about it. He didn't bother to wait until he'd gotten away free and clear, and she could almost hear him saying aloud her own exact words. What a damn nuisance. Yes, he'd even taken the time to pluck off the burrs. Riley gasped, and her eyes snapped open. Fingering the burr in her own hand, she noted how sticky it was, and that its prickles were sharp enough to draw blood. Gather these burrs, she ordered. We might just get a bit of DNA. Bill's eyes widened, and he immediately extracted a Ziploc bag and tweezers. As he worked, her mind ran in overdrive, not done yet. We've been wrong all along, she said. This isn't his second murder. It's his third. Bill stopped and looked up, clearly stunned. How do you know? Bill asked. Riley's whole body tightened as she tried to bring her trembling under control. He's gotten too good. His apprenticeship is over. He's a pro now, and he's just hitting his stride. He loves his work. No, this is his third time, at least. Riley's throat tightened, and she swallowed hard. And there won't be much time now, until the next one. Bill found himself in a sea of blue eyes, none of them real. He didn't usually have nightmares about his cases, and he wasn't having one now, but it sure felt like one. Here in the middle of the doll store, little blue eyes were simply everywhere, all of them wide open and sparkling and alert. The doll's little ruby-red lips, most of them smiling, were troubling also. So was all the painstakingly combed artificial hair, so stiff and immobile. Taking in all these details, Bill wondered now how he could have possibly missed the killer's intention, to make his victims look as doll-like as possible. It had taken Riley to make that connection. Thank God she's back, he thought. Still, Bill couldn't help but worry about her. He had been dazzled by her brilliant work back at Mosby Park, but afterward, when he drove her home, she seemed exhausted and demoralized. She barely said a word to him during the whole drive. Maybe it had been too much for her. Even so, Bill wished that Riley was here right now. She'd decided it would be best for them to split up, to cover more ground more quickly. He couldn't disagree with that. She'd asked him to cover the doll stores in the area, while she would revisit the scene of the crime they'd covered 6 months ago. Bill looked around and, feeling in way over his head, wondered what Riley would make of this doll store. It was the most elegant of the ones he'd visited today. Here on the edge of the Capital Beltway, the store probably got a lot of classy shoppers from wealthy Northern Virginia counties. He walked around and browsed. A little girl doll caught his eye. With its upturned smile and pale skin, it especially reminded him of the latest victim. Although it was fully clothed in a pink dress with lots of lace on the collar, cuffs and hem, it was also sitting in a disturbingly similar position. Suddenly, Bill heard a voice to his right. "I think you're looking in the wrong section." Bill turned and found himself facing a stout little woman with a warm smile. Something about her immediately told him that she was in charge here. "Why do you say that?" Bill asked. The woman chuckled. "Because you don't have daughters. I can tell a man who doesn't have a daughter from a mile off. Don't ask me how. It's just some kind of instinct, I guess." Bill was stunned by her insight and deeply impressed. She offered Bill her hand. "Ruth Bank," she said. Bill shook her hand. "Bill Jeffries. I take it you own this store?" She chuckled again. "I see you've got some kind of instinct too," she said. "I'm pleased to meet you." "But you do have sons, don't you?" "3 of them, I guess." Bill smiled. Her instincts were pretty sharp, all right. Bill figured that she and Riley would enjoy each other's company. "2, he replied, "but pretty damn close." She chuckled. "How old?" she asked. 8 and 10. She looked around the place. "I don't know that I've got much for them here. Oh, actually, I've got a few rather quaint toy soldiers in the next aisle, but that's not the kind of things boys like anymore, is it? It's all video games these days, and violent ones at that." "I'm afraid so." She squinted at him appraisingly. "You're not here to buy a doll, are you?" she asked. Bill smiled and shook his head. "You're good," he replied. "Are you a cop, maybe?" she asked. Bill laughed quietly and took out his badge. "Not quite, but a good guess." "Oh my," she said with concern. "What does the FBI want with my little place? Am I on some kind of list?" "In a way," Bill said. "It's nothing to worry about. Your shop came up on our search of stores in this area that sell antique and collectible dolls." In fact, Bill didn't know exactly what he was looking for. Riley had suggested that he check out a handful of these places, assuming the killer might have frequented them, or at least had visited them on some occasion. What she was expecting, he didn't know. Was she expecting the killer himself to be there? Or that one of the employees had met the killer? Doubtful that they had. Even if they had, it was doubtful that they would have recognized him as a killer. Probably all the men that came in here, if any, were creepy. More likely, Riley was trying to get him to gain more insights into the killer's mind, his way of looking at the world. If so, Bill figured she'd wind up disappointed. He simply did not have the mind that she did, or the talent to easily walk into killers' minds. It seemed to him as if she were really fishing. There were dozens of doll stores within the radius they had been searching. Better, he thought, to let forensics just continue to track down the doll makers, though thus far that had turned up nothing. "I'd asked what kind of case this is," Ruth said, "but I probably shouldn't." "No," Bill said, "you probably shouldn't." Not that the case was a secret anymore. Not after Senator Newborough's people had put out a press release about it. The media was now saturated with the news. As usual, the Bureau was reeling under an assault of erroneous phone tips, and the internet was abuzz with bizarre theories. The whole thing had become a pain. But why tell the woman about it? She seemed so nice, and her store so wholesome and innocent, that Bill didn't want to upset her with something so grim and shocking as a serial murderer obsessed with dolls. Still, there was one thing he wanted to know. "Tell me something," Bill said. "How many sales do you make to adults? I mean, grown-ups, without kids?" "Oh, those are most of my sales by far. To collectors." Bill was intrigued. He'd never have guessed that. "Why do you think that is?" he asked. The woman smiled, an odd, distant smile, and spoke in a gentle tone. "Because people die, Bill Jeffries." Now Bill was truly startled. "Pardon?" he said. "As we get older, we lose people. Our friends and loved ones die. We grieve. Dolls stop time for us. They make us forget about our grief. They comfort and console us. Look around you. I've got dolls that are most of a century old and some that are almost new. With some of them, at least, you probably can't tell the difference. They're ageless." Bill looked around, feeling creeped out at all the century-old eyes staring back at him, wondering how many people these dolls had outlived. He wondered what they had witnessed. The love, the anger, the hate, the sadness, the violence. And yet still they stared back with that same blank expression. They didn't make sense to him. People should age, he thought. They should get old and lined and grey, as he had, given all the darkness and horror there was in the world. Given all that he had seen, it would be a sin, he thought, if he still looked the same. The murder scenes had sunk into him like a living thing, had made him not want to stay young anymore. "They are also not alive," Bill finally said. Her smile turned bittersweet, almost pitying. "Is that really true, Bill? Most of my customers don't think so. I'm not sure I think so either." An odd silence fell. The woman broke in with a chuckle. She offered Bill a colourful little brochure with pictures of dolls all over it. "As it happens, I'm heading to an upcoming convention in DC. You might want to go too. Maybe it will give you some ideas for whatever it is you're searching for." Bill thanked her and left the store, grateful for the tip about the convention. He hoped that Riley would go with him. Bill remembered that she was supposed to interview Senator Newber and his wife this afternoon. It was an important appointment, not just because the senator might have good information, but for diplomatic reasons. Newber really was making things hot for the Bureau. Riley was just the agent to convince him that they were doing all that they could. But will she really show up? Bill wondered. It seemed truly bizarre that he couldn't be sure. Until 6 months ago, Riley was the one dependable thing in his life. He had always trusted her with his life. But her obvious distress worried him. More than that, he missed her. Daunted as he sometimes was by her quicksilver mind, he needed her on a job like this. During the last 6 weeks, he'd also come to realise that he needed her friendship. Or, deep down, was it more than that? Riley drove down the 2-lane highway, sipping on her energy drink. It was a sunny, warm morning. The car windows were down, and the warm smell of freshly baled hay filled the air. The surrounding modest-sized pastures were dotted with cattle, and mountains edged both sides of the valley. She liked it out here. But she reminded herself she hadn't come here to feel good. She had some hard work to do. Riley turned off onto a well-worn gravel road, and after a minute or two, she reached a crossroads. She turned into the national park, drove a short distance, and stopped her car on the sloping shoulder of the road. She got out and walked across an open area to a tall, sturdy oak that stood on the northeast corner. This was the place. This was where Eileen Rogers' body had been found, posed rather clumsily against this tree. She and Bill had been here together 6 months ago. Riley started to recreate the scene in her mind. The biggest difference was the weather. Back then it had been mid-December and bitterly cold. A thin blanket of snow covered the ground. Go back, she told herself. Go back and feel it. She breathed deeply, in and out, until she imagined she could feel a searing coldness passing through her windpipe. She could almost see thick clouds of frost forming with her every breath. The naked corpse had been frozen solid. It wasn't easy to tell which of the many bodily lesions were knife wounds and which were cracks and fissures caused by the icy cold. Riley summoned back the scene, down to every last detail. The wig, the painted smile, the eyes stitched open, the artificial rose lying in the snow between the corpse's splayed legs. The picture in her mind was now sufficiently vivid. Now she had to do what she'd done yesterday, get a sense of the killer's experience. Once again she closed her eyes, relaxed, and stepped off into the abyss. She welcomed that light-headed, giddy feeling as she slipped into the killer's mind. Pretty soon she was with him, inside him, seeing exactly what he saw, feeling what he felt. He was driving here at night, anything but confident. He watched the road anxiously, worried about the ice under his wheels. What if he lost control, skidded into a ditch? He had a corpse on board. He'd be caught for sure. He had to drive carefully. He'd hoped his second murder would be easier than the first, but he was still a nervous wreck. He stopped the vehicle right here. He hauled the woman's body, already naked, Riley guessed, out into the open. But it was already stiffened from rigor mortis. He hadn't reckoned on that. It frustrated him, shook his confidence. To make matters worse, he couldn't see what he was doing at all well, not even in the glare of the headlights which he directed at the tree. The night was much too dark. He made a mental note to do this in daylight next time, if he possibly could. He dragged the body to the tree and tried to put it into the pose that he'd envisioned. It didn't go at all well. The woman's head was tilted to the left, frozen there by rigor mortis. He yanked and twisted it. Even after breaking its neck, he still couldn't set it staring straight forward. And how was he to splay the legs properly? One of the legs was hopelessly crooked. He had no choice but to get a tire iron out of his trunk and break the thigh and kneecap. Then he twisted the leg as well as he could, but not to his satisfaction. Finally, he dutifully left the ribbon around her neck, the wig on her head, and the rose in the snow. Then he got into his car and drove away. He was disappointed and disheartened. He was also scared. In all his clumsiness, had he left any fatal clues behind? He obsessively replayed his every action in his mind, but he couldn't be sure. He knew that he had to do it better next time. He promised himself to do better. Riley opened her eyes. She let the killer's presence fade away. She was pleased with herself now. She hadn't let herself be shaken and overwhelmed, and she'd gotten some valuable perspective. She'd gotten a sense of how the killer was learning his craft. She only wished she knew something, anything, about his first murder. She was more certain than ever that he had killed one earlier time. This had been the work of an apprentice, but not a rank beginner. Just as Riley was about to turn and walk back toward her car, something in the tree caught her eye. It was a tiny dash of yellow peeking out from where the trunk divided in half, a little above her head. She walked around to the far side of the tree and looked up. "He's been back here," Riley gasped aloud. Chills surged through her body and she glanced around nervously. Nobody seemed to be nearby now. Nestled up in the branch of a tree staring down at Riley was a naked female doll with blonde hair, posed precisely the way the killer had intended the victim to be. It couldn't have been there long, 3 or 4 days at most. It hadn't been shifted by the wind or tarnished by rain. The murderer had returned here when he'd been preparing himself for the Reba Fry murder. Much as Riley had done, he had come back here to reflect on his work, to examine his mistakes critically. She took pictures with her cell phone. She'd send those to the bureau right away. Riley knew why he'd left the doll. It's an apology for past sloppiness, she realized. It was also a promise of better work to come. Riley drove towards Senator Mitch Newborough's manor house, and her heart filled with dread as it came into view. Situated at the end of a long tree-lined drive, it was huge, formal, and daunting. She always found the rich and powerful harder to deal with than folks further down the social ladder. She pulled up and parked in a well-manicured circle in front of the stone mansion. Yes, this family was very rich indeed. She got out of the car and walked up to the enormous front doors. After ringing the doorbell, she was greeted by a clean-cut man of about 30. "I'm Robert," he said, "the senator's son. And you must be Special Agent Riley? Come on in. Mother and father are expecting you." Robert Newborough led Riley on into the house, which immediately reminded her how much she disliked ostentatious homes. The Newborough house was especially cavernous, and the walk to wherever the senator and his wife were waiting was disagreeably long. Riley was sure that making guests walk such an inconvenient distance was a sort of intimidation tactic, a way of communicating that the inhabitants of this house were far too powerful to tangle with. Riley also found the ubiquitous colonial furniture and decor to be really quite ugly. More than anything else, she dreaded what was coming next. To her, talking to victims' families was simply awful, much worse than dealing with murder scenes or even corpses. She found it all too easy to get caught up in people's grief, anger and confusion. Such intense emotions wrecked her concentration and distracted her from her work. As they walked, Robert Newborough said, "Father's been home from Richmond ever since..." He choked a little in mid-sentence. Riley could feel the intensity of his loss. "Since we heard about Reba," he continued. "It's been terrible. Mother's especially shaken up. Try not to upset her too much." "I'm so sorry for your loss," Riley said. Robert ignored her and led Riley into a spacious living room. Senator Mitch Newborough and his wife were sitting together on a huge couch, holding each other's hands. "Agent Page," Robert said, introducing her. "Agent Page, let me introduce my parents, the senator and his wife Annabeth." Robert offered Riley a seat, then sat down himself. "First of all," Riley said quietly, "my deepest condolences for your loss." Annabeth Newborough replied with a slight nod of acknowledgement. The senator just sat staring forward. In the brief silence that followed, Riley made a quick assessment of their faces. She'd seen Newborough on television many times, always wearing a politician's ingratiating smile. He wasn't smiling now. Riley hadn't seen so much of Mrs. Newborough, who seemed to possess the typical docility of a politician's wife. Both of them were in their early 60s. Riley detected that they'd both gone to painful and expensive lengths to look younger. Hair implants, hair dye, facelifts, makeup. As far as Riley was concerned, their efforts had left them looking vaguely artificial. Like dolls, Riley thought. "I've got to ask you a few questions about your daughter," Riley said, taking out her notebook. "Were you in close touch with Reba recently?" "Oh yes," Mrs. Newborough said. "We are a very close family." Riley noted a slight stiffness in the woman's voice. It sounded like something she said a little too often, a little too routinely. Riley felt pretty sure that family life in the Newborough home had been far from ideal. "Did Reba say anything recently about being threatened?" Riley asked. "No," Mrs. Newborough said. "Not a word." Riley observed that the senator hadn't said a word so far. She wondered why he was being so quiet. She needed to draw him out. But how? Now Robert spoke up. "She'd been through a messy divorce recently. Things got ugly between her and Paul over custody of their 2 kids. Oh, I never liked him," Mrs. Newborough said. "He had such a temper. Do you think that possibly..." Her words trailed off. Riley shook her head. "Her ex-husband's not a likely suspect," she said. "Why on earth not?" Mrs. Newborough asked. Riley weighed in her mind what she should and should not tell them. "You may have read that the killer struck before," she said. "There was a similar victim near Daggett." Mrs. Newborough was becoming more agitated. "What's any of this supposed to mean to us?" "We're dealing with a serial killer," Riley said. "There was nothing domestic about it. Your daughter may not have known the killer at all. There's every likelihood that it wasn't personal." Mrs. Newborough was sobbing now. Riley immediately regretted her choice of words. "Not personal?" Mrs. Newborough almost shouted. "How could it be anything but personal?" Senator Newborough spoke to his son. "Robert, please take your mother elsewhere and calm her down. I need to talk with Agent Page alone." Robert Newborough obediently led his mother away. Senator Newborough said nothing for a moment. He looked Riley steadily in the eyes. She was sure that he was accustomed to intimidating people with that stare of his, but it didn't work especially well on her. She simply returned his gaze. At last, the senator reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a letter-sized envelope. He walked over to her chair and handed it to her. "Here," he said. Then he walked back to the couch and sat down again. "What's this?" Riley asked. The senator turned his gaze on her again. "Everything you need to know," he said. Riley was now completely baffled. "May I open it?" she asked. "By all means." Riley opened the envelope. It contained a single sheet of paper with 2 columns of names on it. She recognized some of them. 3 or 4 were well-known reporters on the local TV news. Several others were prominent Virginia politicians. Riley was even more perplexed than before. "Who are these people?" she asked. "My enemies," Senator Newborough said in an even voice. "Probably not a comprehensive list, but those are the ones who matter. Somebody there is guilty." Riley was completely dumbfounded now. She sat there and said nothing. "I'm not saying that anybody on that list killed my daughter directly, face to face," he said, "but they sure as hell paid somebody to do it." Riley spoke slowly and cautiously. "Senator, with all due respect, I believe I just said that your daughter's killing probably wasn't personal. There's already been one murder nearly identical to it." "Are you saying that my daughter was targeted purely by coincidence?" the senator asked. Yes, probably, Riley thought, but she knew better than to say so aloud. Before she could reply, he added, "Agent Page, I've learned through hard experience not to believe in coincidences. I don't know why or how, but my daughter's death was political, and in politics, everything is personal. So don't try to tell me it's anything else but personal. It's your job and the Bureau's to find whoever is responsible and bring him to justice." Riley took a long, deep breath. She studied the man's face in minute detail. She could see it now. Senator Newborough was a thorough narcissist. Not that I should be surprised, she thought. Riley understood something else. The senator found it inconceivable that anything in his life wasn't specifically about him and him alone. Even his daughter's murder was about him. Reba had simply gotten caught between him and somebody who hated him. He probably really believed that. "Sir," Riley began, "with all due respect, I don't want you to think," Newborough said. "You've got all the information you need right in front of you." They held each other's gaze for several seconds. "Agent Page," the senator finally said, "I get the feeling we're not on the same wavelength. That's a shame. You may not know it, but I've got good friends in the upper echelons of the agency. Some of them owe me favors. I'm going to get in touch with them right away. I need somebody on this case who will get the job done." Riley sat there, shocked, not knowing what to say. Was this man really that delusional? The senator stood. "I'll send somebody to see you out, Agent Page," he said. "I'm sorry we didn't see eye to eye." Senator Newborough walked out of the room, leaving Riley sitting there alone. Her mouth hung open with shock. The man was narcissistic, all right, but she knew there was more to it than that. There was something the senator was hiding, and no matter what it took, she would find out what it was. The first thing that caught Riley's eye was the doll, the same naked doll she had found earlier that day in that tree near Daggett, in exactly the same pose. For a moment she was startled to see it sitting there in the FBI forensics lab, surrounded by an array of high-tech equipment. It looked weirdly out of place to Riley, like some kind of sick little shrine to a bygone, non-digital age. Now, the doll was just another item of evidence, protected by a plastic bag. She knew that a team had been sent to retrieve it as soon as she called it in from the scene. Even so, it was a jarring sight. Special Agent Meredith stepped forward to greet her. "It's been a long time, Agent Page," he said warmly. "Welcome back." "It's good to be back, sir," Riley said. She walked over to the table to sit with Bill and the lab tech, Flores. Whatever qualms and uncertainty she might be feeling, it really did feel good to see Meredith again. She liked his gruff, no-nonsense style, and he'd always treated her with respect and consideration. "How did things go with the senator?" Meredith asked. "Not good, sir," she replied. Riley noticed a twitch of annoyance in her boss's face. "Do you think he's going to give us any trouble?" "I'm almost sure of it. I'm sorry, sir." Meredith nodded sympathetically. "I'm sure it's not your fault," he said. Riley guessed that he had a pretty good idea of what had happened. Senator Newbra's behaviour was undoubtedly typical of narcissistic politicians. Meredith was probably all too used to it. Flores typed rapidly, and as he did, images of grisly photographs, official reports, and news stories came up on large monitors around the room. "We did some digging, and it turns out you were right, Agent Page," Flores said. "The same killer did strike earlier, way before the Daggett murder." Riley heard Bill's grunt of satisfaction, and for a second, Riley felt vindicated, felt her belief in herself returning. But then her spirit sank. Another woman had died a terrible death. That was no cause for celebration. She had wished, actually, that she had not been right. Why can't I enjoy being right once in a while? She wondered. A gigantic map of Virginia spread out over the main flat-screen monitor, then narrowed to the northern half of the state. Flores tagged a spot high up on the map, near the Maryland border. The first victim was Margaret Geraghty, 36 years old, Flores said. Her body was found dumped in farmland about 13 miles outside of Belding. She was killed on June 25th, nearly 2 years ago. The FBI wasn't called in for that one. The locals let the case go cold. Riley peered at the crime scene photos Flores brought up on another monitor. The killer obviously hadn't tried to pose the body, he'd just dumped her in a hurry and left. 2 years ago, she said, thinking, taking it all in. A part of her was surprised he had been at this for so long. Yet another part of her knew that these sick killers could operate for years. They could have an uncanny patience. She examined the photos. "I see that he hadn't developed his style," she observed. "Right," Flores said. "There's a wig there, and the hair was cropped short, but he didn't leave a rose. However, she was choked to death with a pink ribbon. He rushed through the setup," Riley said. "His nerves got the best of him. It was his first time, and he lacked self-confidence. He did a little better with Eileen Rogers, but it wasn't until the Reba Fry killing that he really hit his stride." She remembered something that she'd wanted to ask. "Did you find any connections between the victims, or between the kids of the two mothers?" "Not a thing," Flores said. "The check of parenting groups came up empty. None of them seemed to know each other." That discouraged Riley, but didn't altogether surprise her. "What about the first woman?" Riley asked. "She was a mother, I take it?" "No," Flores said quickly, as though he'd been waiting for that question. "She was married, but childless." Riley was startled. She was sure that the killer was singling out mothers. How could she have gotten that wrong? She could feel her rising self-confidence suddenly deflate. As Riley hesitated, Bill asked, "Then how close are we to identifying a suspect? Were you able to get anything off of those birds from Mosby Park?" "No such luck," Flores said. "We found traces of leather instead of blood. The killer wore gloves. He seems to be fastidious. Even at the first scene, he didn't leave any prints or DNA." Riley sighed. She had been so hopeful that she'd found something that others had overlooked. But now she felt she was striking out. They were back to the drawing board. "Obsessive about details," she commented. "Even so, I think we're closing in on him," Flores added. He used an electronic pointer to indicate locations, drawing lines between them. "Now that we know about this earlier killing, we've got the order and a better idea of his territory," Flores said. "We've got number 1, Margaret Geraghty, at Belding to the north here. Number 2, Eileen Rogers, over to the west of Mosby Park. And number 3, Reba Fry, near Daggett, farther south." As Riley looked, she saw that the 3 locations formed a triangle on the map. "We're looking at an area of about 1,000 square miles, Flores said. "But that's not as bad as it sounds. We're talking mostly rural areas with a few small towns. In the north you get into some big estates, like the Senators. Lots of open country.